In episode 17 of Mobycast, Chris provides his main takeaways from dockercon 2018. Welcome to Mobycast, a weekly conversation about containerization, Docker, and modern software deployment. Let's jump right in.
Welcome, Chris and Rich.
Hey guys, how's it going?
Good. Time for another Mobycast.
What number are we on now?
17.
So now we're committed to releasing this in order, but it's good because this one should come up soon anyway. Chris was just recently at dockercon, so today's Mobycast will be all about his impressions and takeaways from dockercon 2018. And so we only have 20 minutes, and dockercon took 3 days. So rather than find out what we did over the past week, obviously aside from Chris, who was at dockercon, let's just jump right in. Chris, tell us about dockercon.
So this was my third dockercon in a row. Started up in 2016 in the Seattle one. That one, I believe, was about 2,000 attendees. 2017 was in Austin, and I believe it grew to about 3,500 attendees. And this recent one was in San Francisco, where Docker is headquartered. And they were quoting numbers of between 4,000 to 5,000 attendees, I think. So
I saw a great tweet about that. 4,000 attendees at dockercon. How will they ever, quote, contain them?
Yeah.
Okay, keep going.
It's still a T2 micro conference compared to reInvent. So I think they're okay for a while. But yeah, I mean, the point is it's definitely growing and getting more and more popular. The thing that just blows my mind, every single one of these conferences, they always throw out the stat that about half the people there are brand new to Docker. And, here it is. It's like, Docker has been out there now for 5 or 6 years easily. And you still just have a lot of people, just fresh folks looking at Docker. So, it still has a lot of room to grow, and a lot of market to take down. Some of the numbers they threw out were over the past year, they've had 1 million new user/downloads of Docker Desktop. So that's the client bits for either Windows or Mac, which was kind of interesting. That's definitely a pretty large number for developer reach. And then like on the image side of things, they were quoting numbers in the billions of polls in a matter of 2 weeks. So 1 billion image downloads every 2 weeks is what they're seeing right now on Docker Hub. So pretty big numbers, pretty amazing with that. So Docker's growing, but I think, again, the big thing there is that like there's still lots of room to grow. It's like it kind of feel like we've been working with it for a while now, and it kind of feels saturated. And that's kind of like it's always going to these things. It's always kind of like a realization. It's like, nope, it's not saturated. There's still plenty of room there for growth.
Right.
Yeah. And, let's see. Some of the so I think this one was really interesting too, because this was obviously the first conference since kind of some management changes there at Docker, some pretty big ones. So at the last one in Austin back in April 2017, both co-founders of Docker, Ben the CEO and Solomon the CTO, we're still in place. Since then, both have left the company, and Docker has gotten a new CEO with bringing on board Steve Singh, who founded Concur, which he then sold to SAP. And so it's definitely, I think the personality is definitely changing a bit. I think Docker definitely has some very clear business goals and objectives now, and they've shifted a bit with that management change, and it's definitely intentional. Docker has been around for 5 or 6 years now. It has raised quite a bit of money. It's definitely one of the core key technologies out there today for anyone building software, especially in the cloud. Yet I think they've kind of struggled on the business model, from a business model perspective. So, a great case in point is, here we are, we've been using Docker for quite some time. And the honest truth is we've never given Docker a single penny. Because we're just using the core Docker engine, right? And they don't make any money off of that. So, and that is by far, the common scenario. That's how everyone is using it. So it's kind of like, hey, here's this really great free software to go build your modern software stack on, and basically Docker's a non. It's not even a non. I mean, there's just no money there in that business model. So definitely, as a company, if they want to continue on, they do need to find that business model and find a way to bring money in and to reach profitability, and bringing Steve Singh on board is definitely. It's loud and clear, like that is his number one focus. And that was felt throughout the conference this time. It was definitely obvious that, hey, this is basically their number one priority. And that really came across with, their business model now. The way that they're going to make money is all through their enterprise edition of Docker. That's how they actually get revenue. And so Docker EE was the recurring chant and the recurring theme across the entire conference this time, much more so than it has in previous editions. And in previous editions, it was definitely more about technology and innovation and new features or new products or new technologies. And this one, very little on that front, and instead really focused on Docker EE.
Right. And that's sort of sad. I mean, imagine in 1998, 99, you had been going to a Linux conference every year, and then you go to one in 99 or 2000, and it's still called the Linux conference, and all you hear is Red Hat Enterprise. You would be like, this is not the conference I was planning on going to.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's definitely some of those feelings where, like I said, I mean, it's the personality, the feel of the conference was markedly different than previous ones. Definitely not as much excitement, but again, I realize and I recognize, and I think we want Docker to survive and continue, and they do have to find a way to make money. And so I, in a way, it's kind of just it's just a necessary consequence. I think so. I wish it would be more of a balance.
Sure,
because it used to be like, especially with Solomon kind of taking the role of kind of like being the chief product guy, being a tech guy, being the CTO, co-founder, founder of the company. Really, I think his day-to-day perspective was like, it's all about just building cool technology and innovation, and just really focusing on that, and maybe even to a fault where it was kind of like building technology for technology's sake.
Sure.
And to say like, oh, we can build technology just as good as someone else. So in particular, something like Swarm to me is a bit of a head scratcher, especially at the point in time when they're doing it with Kubernetes already had just such a firm foothold as kind of like the de facto orchestrator to go and build your own competing one. Definitely some questions there. Like, is that really the right thing to do? Definitely cool technology, some great stuff. Some people are using it, but not sure really that's the best use of resources. So
yeah, let's use that as a segue because, so you just mentioned Swarm and you mentioned Kubernetes, and it seems like maybe that's where the excitement has gone, right? So Docker was exciting on its own the last 2 years, and now Docker is a company. The company is trying to make money. They're just doing the things that companies do. And I was at GlueCon a couple months ago, and it was like, whoa, Kubernetes. And now it seems like maybe all of the people that were, fervently working on Docker open source projects are now their attention has shifted to Kubernetes, and that's maybe where the excitement is.
Yeah, I think the truth is that they've always been using Kubernetes, and it is the de facto standard. I think we've talked about this in previous editions podcasts, that it's somewhere around 70% of folks running containers are using Kubernetes as their orchestrator, and then 30% is the rest, whether it be ECS, Swarm, or something else. So people have been using it. I think what was really different with this one is that Docker has just basically opened up its arms and is giving just a huge bear hug to Kubernetes, and just so this is now Docker acknowledging that Kubernetes is the de facto standard, and that they're no longer going to compete against it. Instead, they're going to embrace it. And I think the writing is on the wall there for Swarm. So at this conference, they basically, whenever they talked about orchestration, it was always Kubernetes and Swarm were kind of mentioned as just, you can choose this one or that one. So they're always positioned against the two of them. Notably absent, of course, was any Amazon technology. So ECS was not mentioned once throughout the entire conference, which was also kind of interesting, but not surprising.
Hey, this is Rich. You might recognize me as the guy who introduces the show, but is pretty much silent during the meat of the podcast. The truth is, these topics are oftentimes incredibly complex, and I'm just too inexperienced to provide much value. What you might not know is that John and Chris created the training product to help developers of all skill sets get caught up to speed on AWS and Docker. If you're like me and feel underwater in these conversations, head on over to prodockertraining.com and get on the mailing list for the inaugural course. Okay, let's dive back in.
Really, though, that is surprising to me, because it's not like Docker is competing with Amazon, right? Docker would benefit if Amazon succeeds at using Docker in lots of its products. It doesn't fully make sense to me. That sort of turning their back on Amazon is like turning their back on their stated goal of profit and growth.
No, I mean, think about, so Docker's, business model is really all around Docker EE. And what is Docker EE? Docker EE is the infrastructure software for running basically a data center. And so it's things like user management and permissions and security. It's image repos. It is kind of the UIs and management of how do I deploy apps and hook into orchestration? How do I manage clusters of machines and whatnot? And so all of that, though, is like, that's exactly what AWS does, right? So you get into this situation where it's like, and this is one of the reasons why, Docker EE has not been too terribly interesting to us, and the work that we're doing is like, well, we already get all of those features just about through the collective dashboard that Amazon provides, and especially with things like ECS, with its deep integration with all the other AWS technologies such as auto-scale groups and Route 53 and load balancers and whatnot. So especially ECS is very much a competitor to them. They do give it a little bit of lip service to the fact that, like, hey, if you got some EC2s, that you're running, some, I don't know, Kubernetes on or something like that, then you can go ahead, you can manage that with Docker EE. But if you're all in Amazon, then it's really hard to make a compelling reason for why you would use Docker EE. So I think maybe the other thing there too is that you can say that in a way they don't compete, in that Docker and Docker EE is probably it's definitely much more suited for enterprises that are mostly on-prem or maybe hybrid, and they're not really going after the folks that are kind of like all in the public cloud, especially something like AWS. So, I get in that from that standpoint, they can say they're going after different customer segments. But they're not going to be
It just feels so fraught with mistakes. It's like, let's build a bunch of management software that loves being on-prem, and put our whole company's bet behind it, while Docker is like the best and easiest way to get off-prem onto the cloud. Like, oops, come on, Docker, come on. I don't know. It just doesn't sound right to me. It's like building management software for managing application installations on-prem is great. I'm glad that they're doing that. But betting their company on it and ignoring Amazon, it's like they should figure out a way. To me, it just feels like they should figure out a way to have a pay-for version of Docker where enterprises can feel comfortable that they're not downloading some sort of scary open source software, that they can get support on the Docker containers that they have in production on the cloud or on-prem, and that maybe it has just a little bit of features here and there just to sort of like get a little insight into what's happening with your containers, and some sort of seal of approval, some sort of like maybe they have certificates in them or something that you can only get from Docker to sort of prove to yourself that these containers are real Docker EE containers, something like that. And then that's it. Like, don't build all this management software and put your whole company behind it. It just seems ridiculous to me, given what Docker is for. Anyway, maybe that's too strong of an opinion, but it's wild to me what they're doing.
Yeah, I think this is definitely a work in progress for them, and I don't think they're really executing right now against like a 5-year plan. I think this is just more of a what's going to happen over the next year or two. I mean, all that said, I mean, I'm sure they've had plenty of discussions, and
sure,
they've thought through all this stuff, and they do have like those longer term plans. But I think they're looking at it as like, look, this enterprise market that's out there where folks have these legacy apps running on outdated systems that need to be modernized. It's such a huge opportunity. It's not really being served so well. This is where they can focus, right? They can say like, this is where we have a really strong message. And that's phase one. They are kind of given the promise of like, okay, yeah, Docker is a great way for moving your stuff around and getting it off on-prem or just run it anywhere, whether that's, running it on-prem, private cloud, public cloud. But I don't know, it kind of feels like there's still like, for right now, Amazon is just really not part of those near-term plans.
Right. It reminds me, for those who have been keeping up with Silicon Valley, it reminds me of the box. Like Docker is like, I've got it. Let's make a box. And then that you can put onto your data center shelves. Like, let's make a Docker box, and you can literally plug it in.
I've not been keeping up on Silicon Valley. But
you can imagine a box. You can imagine a physical piece of hardware, and you can imagine like making a ridiculous decision to build a physical piece of hardware when you have this awesome software.
Yeah. And by the way, that whole thing did happen back in the early 2000s. So back then, instead of a box, it was called an appliance. And that was the big way of that was a whole trend. So I think, so it may be coming back around, right? Like this whole cyclical thing where like, because it really was true. Like that was the way that you sold your software into kind of like a way of putting kind of tangible value on it, is you sell it as a box that someone can buy and then just rack it and stack it in a data center.
Okay, so we've had the Kubernetes discussion. We've had the mysteriously absent AWS discussion. AWS, by the way, was there. They had a huge booth, and the AWS DevRels were tweeting up a storm the whole time. So it wasn't that they weren't there, but I guess they weren't mentioned in any big keynotes or other types of breakout sessions that much.
No, and very little presence on the speaking circuit. There was the talk by Abby Fuller that kind of the remix version that she did the same talk in Austin as well about making efficient Docker images. But I think when she did. She's recently at Amazon. I don't think she's been there all that long. I forget where she was before that, but yeah, it was in previous conferences they actually had big announcements with AWS and partnerships, and like they actually had Docker for AWS was one of their product pushes as recently as 2 years ago, and all that stuff just is gone.
Interesting.
no longer there. So,
and there's rampant speculation around the internet that Docker is, they'll be the next to go. They'll get bought by a Microsoft or a Google. It would be interesting to see if Microsoft or Google kind of got into a war over trying to get Docker. And based on the CEO there, based on their attempts to sort of clean everything up and get focused on getting cash flow positive, that aligns with that speculation.
It brings in a whole bunch of so Steve's on board now, and his whole thing is get it to cash flow positive. They're rallying around Docker EE, and it's basically all about sales now. That's going to dictate whether or not they can get there. I think it's very much a big question mark on whether or not like EE can get enough traction to actually be a viable business model that sustains the current valuation, that they've raised at. So, I think it's a hard road for them to go. It's kind of hard to see down the road them being strong enough financially to warrant an IPO. I think definitely acquisition makes a lot more sense here, and definitely much more reasonable valuations and a much easier acquisition to make versus like a GitHub type thing. So I think this is like a slam dunk for Microsoft to come in and just do it. And it's a 1-2 punch. They got GitHub and Docker, and it's all about, we're back to the Steve Ballmer on the stage, screaming developers.
And I would say that Docker really is, if they were to look at which one would, be it Google or be it Microsoft, which one are they courting themselves to? It's pretty obviously Microsoft, right? Because they're saying, let's make this easy for legacy systems. Let's get legacy systems on here. Let's build on-prem tools. Whereas if they were cozying up to Google, they would probably think about what's exciting for startups, what's exciting for big data companies. And that would be more interesting to Google, I think, in the Google Cloud mindset.
Yeah, so absolutely, spot on. Microsoft, their core customer base is definitely the enterprise. That's what they've always been super strong in. And so that fits really, really well here. And then the other thing is that, Docker and Microsoft have been really tight over the last few years as they work to bring Docker to Windows and then get deeper integration. So there's been a lot of collaboration between those companies, definitely much, much more so than with Google. So they have a long stand. Just about every single one of these shows, they always have some Microsoft person up on stage. And that was true again this year. So they had one of the SVPs from Windows, I believe it was, as part of the keynote with Steve Singh. So they already
Microsoft is working its way backwards towards Docker just as fervently. So at GlueCon, Brendan Burns was on stage showing Visual Studio, and he had a plugin that was only available on his machine. That was like, so I right click here and I put, I click the button that says Kubernetes and staging, and voila, see, now I've got this thing running right here in Visual Studio in a Kubernetes cluster, and I can see it and play with it right here. And there's my code still on the screen.
Yeah.
Well, I certainly hope that they get that done quickly, because while Docker makes itself more boring as a company, let's just get this part over with so that they can become part of Microsoft. And then if there is a DockerCon 2019, it'll be a big Microsoft funded event, and maybe have some more interesting things and new innovations, because there's certainly, the thing is, Microsoft is moving quickly. They're not looking sluggish at making new technology and new stuff, and their development sets of development tools. So DockerCon 2019, if Docker is part of Microsoft, can be pretty fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's again, full speed ahead. So, with the Amazon being such a fierce competitor with Microsoft and Google, and just Amazon having such a huge lead, definitely can see Microsoft saying, okay, what's next? Let's we have our strategy. Let's execute against it and get back to those developer roots and getting people really coming back to Microsoft as like the great platform for building on. Because Amazon has kind of taken that a bit with cloud being the platform now.
Sure. Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Rich, for yet another fun week. And maybe next week we can talk a little bit more about some of the technical stuff that, the few bits and pieces that did come out of DockerCon that were interesting.
You bet. All right. Thanks, guys.
See ya. Well, dear listener, you made it to the end. We appreciate your time and invite you to continue the conversation with us online. This episode, along with show notes and other valuable resources, is available at mobycast.fm/17. If you have any questions or additional insights, we encourage you to leave us a comment there. Thank you, and we'll see you again next week.